As we discussed at one time about the Gupta rule and the Gupta Empire in India, that of course did decline with the death of Chandragupta II. Excuse me for this. The situation is that this empire, founded by his grandfather, had taken the different areas which were basically regionally controlled and united them into one empire. The death of Chandragupta II, though, had left each of the different sections striving for their own control. This defeat was basically centered around the death of Gupta II and the struggle then among the different regions for control. That allowed then the group called the White Huns to attack. This was basically the same time as the fall of the Roman Empire, as you can see the date in your textbook. So this was basically around that same time where another group, also Huns, had moved from the east to the west. These, of course, the White Huns, were coming from the north down into India. So you have a power struggle that takes place. The Huns never really stayed. They were not really necessarily striving to control the entire area. They were more marauders in the sense that they came in, took over an area briefly, and then moved away to attack some other area, or were driven out because of a lack of a cohesive governmental control. What we wind up with is that the fall of the Gupta Empire wound up leading to, for several centuries, a uncoordinated ruling of different areas in India. And it's not going to be united until another group coming from the west and north, the Muslims, arrive, that you wind up with an established controlling government. As we go and continue in the chapter, it talks about Buddhism. This is one of the aspects that the Buddhist religion had been pushed away with Hinduism, but then also came back through and settled in a number of different areas. As I just mentioned, the Islamic forces came through, the Muslims, and controlled the different regions, including Afghanistan, Pakistan, and then over into India. That attitude of Islam is that no statue should be made for worshiping God, that Allah cannot be depicted in a human form and should not be. So there are no images of Allah in the Islamic faith, and they also do not, they're basically not going to have these icons to other gods. And unfortunately, one of the situations that took place, and it mentions here about in Afghanistan, large Buddha figures had been carved into mountainsides, and these are like 60 or 70 feet tall. And unfortunately, the Taliban in Afghanistan destroyed quite a bit of the statue. What you see here is the holographic. There's some parts that are left there, but for the most part, it's been destroyed. But in 2015, a Chinese couple asked and received permission to use holograms to basically project how the statue used to look. And that's really what you see here. This is how the statue used to look. It is not in that shape now. It's basically in ruins because of the Taliban having destroyed it. What we also have is that as the Hindu religion develops and grows, you have different gods associated with this. This is Ganesh. Now Ganesh is a son of Shiva and also of the goddess Parvati. And he is the Lord of success, as it says in your book. He's the destroyer of evil and obstacles. He will help you dealing with these problems. He's displayed typically, as you can see here, and I'll raise this up a little bit, with the body and face essentially of an elephant. And it's depicted in a number of different ways, different drawings, different artwork, little statuary that's offered there. Here's a part of the celebration. And then even displays here, such as this. This is actually a painting that we have. Um, Ganesh is one of those interesting figures because, again, it's very popular. Uh, Elephant head with one tusk, usually with one broken. And again, you can't make that out here. Let's see if we can get that raised again. You'll see here's the broken one. And that's typically how he's offered. This idea that Feast of the Lord success, the defeater of obstacles. Why does he have one broken? Well, it's because he has defeated. You are not going to gain success without some struggle. Very important, very popular, and it gives you some more details about him here, and this idea that we see and how this figure is still depicted in art today. Meanwhile, as Hinduism and Buddhism moving along over the centuries, Hinduism eventually forces Buddhism out, as Hinduism, such as under the Gupta Empire, became the dominant religion. Buddhism starts moving out into different areas. Excuse me. But they also move in different areas because of the trade that develops. We had talked a little bit about how along the coastal areas, the different regions such as Mohenjo-daro had access to rivers and to the sea, and were able to then trade. And these travelers took with them not only goods to sell, but also their own culture, such as religion. So this expands off into different areas, as I mentioned here about Myanmar, Thailand, Cambodia, etc. One of the key aspects that we also see during this time is that the Buddhist faith, when they arrived at these areas, such as in Java, in Indonesia, is the building of the temples, the structures here. In this case, 9 stacked platforms, and you can't really tell too well that these are stacked, but you can see it a little bit here, so that literally each one is going up. And you have the statuary, and as it tells you in your book, these are life-size images of Buddha, and as it says here, there's more than 500 of these. And you have the stupa, which are essentially the raised columns. All of these go into creating this structure. One of the more impressive structures also, though, is in Cambodia, and that is the Angkor Wat temple, and literally it means temple city. I've posted at Canvas some other details about this religious site, which currently is not being used for religion, but it was originally Hindu and then taken over by Buddhism. But this is the largest religious site in the world. It is a huge complex. It says here there's a perimeter and inner walls, towers, galleries. If you go and look at what I posted online, you'll see just how large it is. As it says here, Angkor means holy city or temple city. This was built probably begun, as it says here, in 802. Possibility was begun at that time with smaller buildings, and then it was extended, as it says here, by Suryavarman, which Angkor Wat is associated with his building of it. There probably were parts already built, is the supposition, but the majority of it was built during his reign. Connection to Vishnu, one of the Hindu gods, but it does eventually become, by the 1200s, this complex become Buddhist. It is a very impressive structure, and you can just barely make out in the picture that you have in your textbook just how large the complex is. It is on a massive scale. It really is. But it's very impressive, and it's now, of course, a heritage site, World Heritage Site. It's not used for religious purposes on a regular basis anymore. But that gives us an idea of some of the architectural styles that are able to be accomplished. The other details that are being used throughout this area they go back literally centuries. In this case, Angkor Wat goes back to the middle of the 12th century, the 1100s, early 12th century, in fact. You have other large architectural feats accomplished that rival anything that's going to be built in Europe. Also, at the same time when this is occurring, and even earlier from India, when we talked about the Mohenjo-Daro culture around 2500 BC, probably earlier, well, at the same time that's occurring, you have in China the development of a culture. This is the map of China, as you are probably already well aware. It's a very large structure, very in the sense of the structure of the country itself as we think of it modern day. At the time that we're looking at, 3000 to 2000 BCE, these are going to be individual areas, such as here and here. That's why you have the different names. They don't become a unified country for quite some time. And even then, when we start talking about the early empires and the dynasties, it's really going to be sort of located around this area and then gradually spanning off to the coast. But much of this area to the west and to the south will not be settled, will not be unified, in the sense of there are people living in this region. They're just not going to be incorporated into what would be the dynasties. Also, China is essentially cut off. You have Mongolia here with the Mongolian desert. You have the desert off this way. You have not only just the Great Wall, which serves to isolate it, but you have physical features, mountains. So that literally, here's the Himalayas. So that literally this region over here is separated from what's taking place elsewhere, especially to the west, as we think of Europe and even northern Africa with Egypt. It's not that people were not aware there were others over here. They were. The Romans had trade with this area. They just didn't come over here. I think I may have mentioned Rome tried one foray into this region, sending a legion, thinking that that's all would be needed to conquer these people and then control the trade directly. They were routed. Many of the legionnaires were captured. Some of them wound up being used to train the military and married into Chinese heritage. But Rome just basically wiped that legion off the books. It literally became the Forgotten Legion, the Lost Legion. Nobody mentioned it anymore because they didn't want to rehash and go back through this whole idea of we lost. So they maintained trade by using those in the Middle East who came over and established what was called the Silk Road, where the Chinese traders, as we will call them, Traders, would take the goods over to a certain point, meet up with the merchants from the Middle East, and then exchange the goods for what they were looking for, what they needed, the money, etc., and they would bring that back. But that's what you're looking at when you see China. It was originally a series of different regions that are going to be united later. As your book shows you here, they talk about that occurring around 1500 or so with the Shang Dynasty. This is BCE. So that would be approximately 1,000 years before the Roman Republic emerged. Your book puts it here. It's the same time as King Tut becoming Pharaoh of Egypt. It's the same time as when the Mycenaeans and the Minoans had their cultures, ones that we've already looked at in previous chapters. But you'll notice the date here about this eggshell pottery, dating from probably 3000 to 2000 BCE, and that's the Longshan culture. As I mentioned earlier, the idea of the empire, the idea about the attempt to unify the different regions doesn't occur till much later. But we have people living in these areas, establishing cultures, living in places and building towns, being agrarian, farming the regions, and establishing that culture much earlier than what we now call the Shang Dynasty, occurring in 1500. Much earlier. As you'll see here, this pottery dates to about 3000, so people were clearly there with skills, with technology, able to make such pottery in such delicate shape, going far back, 3,000 probably earlier, which puts it early, earlier than some of the other cultures. And so we see that culture is occurring elsewhere. The development of urban settings, using of tools for purposes of agrarian growth, for making the buildings, the architecture, for crafting goods, and not only goods but also ornaments. This one is, of course, going back to about 1100 something BCE. It's a pouring vessel. You can see just how elaborate this is. It says this is tiger and owl decoration. It is cast in bronze. It is a technologically advanced situation for this one. We've already seen, since it's probably ceremonial, then there are ceremonies and rituals, religious views that have already been established in this quite some time earlier. So we have all these details that are part of this. So China is well developed early. When the Shang Dynasty comes along around 1500 or so, they get replaced by the Shu Dynasty. As it says here, the Shu Dynasty has, they last for quite some time, 800 years, but it's an up and down situation. It's not a continuous and peaceful rule under the Shus. Rather, there is, as your book says, no strong central government, but instead they sort of coordinate the different areas, the different regions. You can go back to the map and see the different names that are listed there. Provinces, as they were basically called, which really ran themselves and just aligned themselves if the emperor needed them for military expeditions or other situations. It was sort of a loose confederation then, really, that really didn't seek to owe much to the Shus, but as it says here, they feuded frequently with each other and the central authorities. You have an up and down situation. By the 200s BCE, the Shus' control, or as such as that it was basically gone. The individual provinces were kingdoms in and of themselves for the most part, and those who ruled those individual kingdoms saw themselves as not aligned with any particular figure. However, one emerges during this time, and during the period of the Warring States, by the toward the end of the 3rd century BCE, this one individual from the area of Qin, which your book will spell as Qin, emerges as the most dominant warlord, and he seeks to expand that control in other areas. And so we go to the Qin Dynasty. I'm going to move on. We'll come back to Confucianism in a moment. I'm going to go ahead and go to the Qin Dynasty. Bear with me just a moment. We'll come back to Confucius in just a moment. But the Qin Dynasty, we really don't have the name of this individual, but he is called the first emperor because he led his military in a series of excursions into these different other provinces, those other kingdoms, and conquered them and created a unified region that we now call China. The name China coming from Qin, this one particular state, this one particular region, and he established what we call the Qin Dynasty. He doesn't last long. He takes over basically in 221, and he dies in 210 BCE. But for a while, during that decade, or a little over a decade, China is unified. There is a strong central government. There is a force in place, and he did not tolerate any attempts at insurrection or rebellion. He put it down quickly. Swift punishment and very harsh punishment for those who tried to oppose him. He really was a strong figure. Now, mentions about his building of the Great Wall of China. He didn't build it. Rather, parts of this had already been built by the different regions. They built protective aspects to it. What the first emperor did was to have every family contribute a worker. Also, prisoners of war, which he had quite a few. Slaves that were the conquered people that were then subjugated. Those were all put to work to restore areas and to construct new. This becomes an important aspect. If you've ever, those of you who've ever watched the Disney movies Mulan, either one, the animated or live action one, this will look familiar to you. These areas up here, you see one here, and you see one off over here. And you can see off a distance one here. These were watchtowers. So that literally someone here or here or here or here is watching over different areas. This one's looking that direction and that direction. This one looking here and there and also this other direction. This one can see that way as well as this way and this way. So you have eyes in all different directions. If an invasion was spotted, then a fire would be lit here. And the smoke would go up to, so that this side, this would then set up a fire. And literally the smoke signals will go all around, so that they would know where it was sent and where the invading forces might be coming from. It was a key aspect of it for a protective device and protective area. The Qin dynasty is one of these major figures in the sense of playing and how China developed. The first emperor, as I said, was a very strong figure, but he also put in place a number of other areas and controls that proved very workable, and they were also very beneficial. One that he put in, he didn't care in the different regions how you may pronounce the word or say it or what word you used. You were going to write it all the same way. He had a common writing system put in place. So if, an example, if one region referred to a piece of furniture as a sofa, but another one in another region called that same piece of furniture a couch, he didn't care. Sofa or couch, write it the same way. They would all be written with the same word, so that literally any letter reaching any other area could be read, regardless of the dialect. So he has a uniform writing system in place. He also put weights and measures, as your book mentions, so that literally what you weighed in one region, you go and get that same amount weighed out equitably, so that you weren't getting like 1.5 pounds of grain in one place, but only 1.25 pounds in another, because the measurement was different. No, uniform measures. He also put in place another aspect. He really, because he was trying to control such this large area, he had a road system put in place. But roads, as we all know, get run down, especially when you have wagons going back and forth on them. Ruts develop. Well, he took care of that problem by saying that, all right, told all the wagon builders all across, all wagons will be built with the same size axle. They would all be built same width. So that literally, when ruts did develop, all a person driving a wagon had to do was line up the wheels with the ruts, and it would work because there weren't different sizes. So there was a uniform structure, and that was put into place in manufacturing purposes. He did all of this. And he also, as your book mentions, had the works of Confucius burned, because he didn't want anyone going against his views. And so you have that aspect too. And that's going to cause a major issue later, because after he dies and you have a new dynasty come in, the works of Confucius have to be recreated. Literally, many from memory, some from some of the preserved texts that managed to avoid being burned. What this first emperor also did, though, was to plan for his own burial. And in your book, it shows you this. This is the first emperor's army. There are approximately 8,000 of these life-size figures in terracotta and horses that are also put in there. Now, some of them have been destroyed over the years. You can see that back here. If you look, you can see that some of these are not in good shape, but others are still in very good shape, as you can see here. Some are not, but you can see horses, life-size. These figures of the warriors, the protective army. When he went to his death and burial, he expected his army to be there with him to protect him when he awoke in eternal life. And so you have these figures, and these are called the terracotta warriors. You will also see, if I can get this over here for you, that these are now, this whole area is now surrounded with a building, and that people can walk in and look, but you don't get to go down and touch. This was found in 1974. I think your book mentions that date for you. I remember when it occurred. A man was out with some of his neighbors and friends. They were getting ready to sink new wells for his farm. And as they were digging down into the ground, they ran into a couple of these figures. And they kept finding more and more. And eventually they called in the archaeological experts that China has. And they came out and realized this was the burial site of the first emperor. It mentions about his burial chamber has been located, but remains unexcavated. Possibly. What China tends to do, they will find some archaeological location. They'll find something unique for archaeology. They wait until they have explored it quite definitively before they will announce to the world what they have found. They do this with fossils. There have been a number of fossils found in and around China, up in Mongolia, where the Chinese archaeological teams go, in the Gobi Desert, for instance. But they don't announce it immediately until after they really get the details handled. They do not want others trying to come in and either desecrate the site or in some way find something before the Chinese do. So the terracotta warriors were found, and then eventually the news was released. And they're very protective of these, rightfully so. If you look in your course module, though, and I'm going to show you this one very quickly, hopefully it'll call up soon. Takes a while. I apologize for the delay here. In the course module, you'll see that I have about a Chinese terracotta warrior. A few years ago, we'll click on this. A few years ago, the Franklin Museum in Philadelphia was granted an exhibit of the terracotta warriors. And they were all excited about it. They really were. And they were going to do it in the new year. So they came in the fall. They had the display unit already. And then they threw a party, an ugly Christmas sweater party, in the middle of December. And then they were going to close for a couple of weeks and then reopen in the new year and get this exhibition ready. As you can see, an individual went in to the pier, that this Michael Rohanna went in. He had been drinking at the party, was a little inebriated. He snuck back behind where he's not supposed to be, started taking selfies with the terracotta warrior and the horse figures. And before he left, as it says right here, he examined one a little more closely. And as it says here, he reached out, grabbed the left thumb, and broke it off. The desecration was not found until after the first of the year, because again, the museum closed. And I'm going to go back to my tab here. The museum closed, and when the curator or one of the individuals looking and monitoring the exhibition saw what had happened, everybody was notified, and the FBI was called in. That one terracotta warrior is valued at over $4 million. The estimation for the thumb was over $100,000 or more. That was the estimation. So this made it a major art theft. The FBI, they went through the video from the night of the party. They were able to identify the man. He had also posted it all on social media anyway. He literally put it up at that time on Snapchat. Pictures of himself with the warrior, pictures of himself with the thumb. He lived in Delaware. The FBI showed up at his parents' house, which is where he was living. Michael Rohan, 24-year-old man, was asked a very simple question: do you have something you want to say or show us? And so he took them up to his room and opened a dresser drawer where, among items of clothing, there was the thumb. He was arrested, of course, put on trial, but the trial ended in a mistrial. They couldn't agree. Some of the jurors felt that this wasn't worthy of being punished. The Chinese government was not happy. They felt it was a major breach of agreements between the Chinese government and the American government, a breach of faith that the Franklin Museum had made to keep their items, these exhibits, safe. A number of postings on social media from Chinese individuals were just outraged at the mistrial about this, which means he literally got off. Some of them were a little excessive, saying, so this means I can go to America and break the torch off of the Statue of Liberty and I won't be punished. That was one of the postings. It's a situation that just remarkable. And you can understand then why the Chinese do not want people necessarily knowing and getting access to what they find, because to them, it'll just get broken. And this is part of what we see. But the Qin dynasty doesn't last long. The first emperor dies in 210 BCE. He had this great tomb built. What's in it, we do not know. The Chinese have not revealed if they have excavated it yet or if they have found anything else. But we do know about this. Again, the terracotta warriors were first acknowledged, and displays were presented starting in the 70s and early 80s, 1970s and 1980s. But this is part of what we have. When the first emperor died, that control that he was able to exhibit and manifest ended. The war between the different areas, the different regions, broke out again, just as it had with the ending of the Shu dynasty. And so you wind up having a lack of control for a while until the next dynasty rises. But you do have great art, great work. The terracotta warriors alone are a phenomenal feat. The Han dynasty comes in, and they rule for a while, literally about 400 plus years. And they are essentially administrative. The Han emperor of Gaozu, he comes in and allows the regional quote-unquote governors to have a certain amount of control, but again, report to him. So that helped us, but it did help to keep the central authority, and he worked on imperial, as it says, administration here. It was an enforcement, and part of what he did was try to create this collective attitude and views, including the work of Confucius. And that's what we're going to go back now to, the one about Confucius. Now, Confucius is an individual. It is not really a religion. It is a philosophic stance. You'll see the dating for Confucius is in the 6th to early 5th century BCE. That's essentially at the same time that we saw with Buddhism. This is also basically the same time as the founding of the Roman Republic. So this is taking place in China And Confucius comes in and speaks about certain views and attitudes one should take toward life. That there are inner virtues and external virtues. That we should, of course, all be recognized that we are born right with righteousness, integrity, love for others, altruism, which means doing work for others, not for self, and loyalty. That those are the natural virtues that all people have inherently. Now we also need to strive for decorum, that sense of following procedure and ritual, and then also, i.e., proper behavior, and then also culture, the sense of understanding what every other aspect means and how it relates and what we can gain from it, i.e., an education. So part of this course, we talk about culture and values. Confucius would probably approve of the intent of our course. It's really not religion, but as I said earlier, it's a philosophy. Another philosophy that emerges also is Taoism, and it's around the same time. You'll sometimes see the word Tao here, D-A-O, spelled with a T. Taoism is the same, and sometimes it'll be pronounced Taoism because of that, but really it's the same word, just the letter is a little off. It's the same meaning. And Tao simply means the way. So the teaching here was about the way, that one should, it's almost a Stoic principle, that we need to follow the path of least resistance, do not try to or strive for conflict, avoid conflict, that instead we need to, as it says here, recognize there are limits to what we can as humans do and what we can understand and learn, that we need to work on understanding what we can know, not strive for other areas, and not try to push against other people. It uses the image about the water, that the water will give way to the rocks in its path and flow around it, but eventually the water will wear down the rock. And that's the Taoist attitude. Don't keep trying to push against people, just flow around them, and eventually they will give in to you. They will eventually be worn down by your lack of resistance. And it became a very key philosophic attitude and view that surfaces again and is followed still even to this day. We're going to go back now to the Han Dynasty, because what the Han Dynasty tried to do was to develop this sense of Confucius teachings and also Taoism, so that, again, don't strive and struggle and have rebellions. Let's just accept what we have, think about our primary virtues, and let's seek to gain culture and decorum, and go with the flow, if you will, as the Taoists would say. When the Han Dynasty fell, the Tang Dynasty took over, primarily because, again, the Han Dynasty, trying to maintain all those regions and balance one against the other and keep a central government, faltered in that attempt. And what we wind up with is the Tang Dynasty emerging. For a period of about 300 or 400 years after the fall of the Han Dynasty, it was again the individual city-states, if you will, the individual regions, controlling what they had, locking themselves into their views and warring against each other, essentially. The Tang Dynasty comes along in the 7th century, 600s, and is able to, as it says here, reunite China. It's only about a 300-year period, but you have a much more stable period, a much more focused time, and it's also during this era that you wind up with some of the great poetry and art that's done. And this era and the dynasty that follows it really foster the arts, they foster philosophy and literature, they foster architecture. You start having greater buildings taking place during this era as well, primarily because of the stability that the government was able to afford. The Song Dynasty, as I said, comes in after the Tang Dynasty. As it mentions here, ability and education was important. They set up in the Song Dynasty, you wind up actually having a civil service exam established, They were not after the people born from the highest families necessarily. They were looking for the most capable people to be part of the government. They wanted those who were able to do the job, not those people who had the right family tree. And that became a really important aspect during this time, because anyone from any walk of life almost could achieve. And that became really important. As it says here, it became a technological trailblazer, because if people showed they were skilled, the Song Dynasty emperors and the other people in the government would take that individual and say, here, keep working at this. You're doing something that's really important. We believe in you. Make it work. It's during this era, around 1,000 or so is the supposition, that they developed movable type. Now that's about several centuries before Gutenberg in Europe will develop movable type. Printing press was already in place in China well before you start having movable type in the printing press in Europe. They just didn't tell anybody. They did not reveal this. They kept themselves isolated. They maintained the trade with others, but they weren't going to let anybody else in and see their quote-unquote stuff. It's not going to be until a little later that the way the cities were built, the elaborate structures that were part of it, the architecture that's going to be even revealed to the West. But you do have gunpowder was developed, compasses were developed. All that's taking place. Now, gunpowder was partly for war, but also very much part of celebrations. It becomes the basis for the fireworks. And the Chinese had developed fireworks as a way of celebrating, and this was during the Song Dynasty. As I mentioned, it's during the Tang and Song Dynasty that you have the building of literature. It had always been part of their culture, except for the first emperor who wanted to burn books. But it's during the Tang Dynasty that you have some of the great poets. You have one that's not mentioned in your book named Tu Fu, T-U-F-U. You'll also see it with D-U-F-U. Two separate words, two names. And then you have one called Li Bo, and this is one we're going to look at here. You'll sometimes see it with L-I-B-O or L-I-P-O, but it's Li Bo. And you'll see 700s is when he is writing beautiful poetry, strong melancholy tone in many of the words. They're just really lovely. And you have a couple of examples here of his writing. Unfortunately for Li Bo, he was a bit of a drinker, bit of a player, I guess we could say. He was married 4 times, your book mentioned, but as one of his, they have a quote in your book, contemporary says, none detained him for very long. He didn't stay married long, and even when he was married, he wasn't very faithful. He was always getting into trouble for some of his philosophic and political stances, even to the point where when he wound up supporting a rival to the setting emperor, because again, you had some who were always trying to change, Li Bo gets exiled. Says his addiction to wine was legendary, part of it. He writes about wine in a number of his poems. There's a beautiful melancholy one talking about himself alone with his shadow, the moon, and wine. It's a beautiful poem, but really excellent writer, very much in a sense of a lyric writer, and his choice of subjects and his handling of those subjects, the use of imagery, is going to eventually inspire poets in the 18th, in late 18th and early 19th century, when the Chinese culture is re-examined and becomes very modish. It becomes what everyone wants. It's very modish at that time. And so the transcendentalists and the other who are part of the Romantic movement in that era in the 1700s and 1800s are going to embrace the Chinese poets, including the works of Li Guo. You have others writing as well. For instance, this is during the Song Dynasty, is Li Qingzhao, and she was, and this is what's really interesting. This is a female. She was married at an early age. She and her husband would exchange writings because he traveled for politics and business. And so whenever they were separated, they would send letters to one another, and quite often in the form of poetry. Her husband died when she was fairly young. She continued writing, as it says here, and she never remarried. But her poetry, it says here, is in what's called C form, which is lyric poetry to be sung with very specific rhymes and rhythms. That's part of what we have, and we have the details here that you have an example of one here. Again, another poet who has just a wonderful sense of rhythm and imagery and development. She's just a really good poet. I really do like the Chinese poets of the Tang and Song Dynasty because they're writing almost seemingly from the heart. They pour out their views. They look at the world around them, though, and offer these attitudes and comments about what they see. Very strong writers. Du Fu, who's not listed in your book, is another one who does the same thing. He gets involved in some of these wars that were taking place, and he goes and fights in them. But he writes about the experience in war. He writes about his longing to return home, and how happy he's going to be when he's back with his wife. It's just beautiful writing of this era. We also have the development in other ways, as it mentions here about the visual arts. Again, you can see this is a pendant. It's not very large, 7 inches by 3 inches. So it's not very tall, but this is the dragon. As it says here, the dragons represent fertility. They are also supposed to represent the development of the concepts of what is important to them, strength, power. This one is the image of the flying horse because it's on top of a swallow here. That foot is, so literally the horse is flying. And again, not necessarily very big, very simple structure in this way, but the details that they use shows the skill that they're able to accomplish. And so you have bronze, you have stoneware, you have jade. All these are part of it, and it's just really a remarkable work. Very much as it says here, realism is taking place. You have, of course, the fantastical with the dragon here, and then you have the realistic here. Bear with us just a moment as it's trying to change. Cengage is a little iffy today. Let's see if, there we go. With painting also, you can see again the use of delicate drawings and efforts here. This is from the 8th century, 750 they estimate. It's ink on paper. You have here also ink on silk, and the detailing here. This one shows you, though, they are capable of immense work, not just the smaller one we've seen so far, but this is Buddha, 136 feet by 118 feet, in case you're wondering. This is an area of China, and it has been preserved. The Chinese government, although they do not have a religious attitude, a state religion of any sort, they are very conscious of their heritage, and this site has been maintained. As you see here, here's Buddha in the center, with the priests monks on each side, and it's just a really remarkable accomplishment that they did. Probably, as it says here, begun in the 500s and finished probably a couple hundred years later. Again, you can see the details that are offered. Literally, it's carved into the side of this mountain, and just remarkable figures. And the details that are put into it, and the work that is done into it. You can see how elaborate some of the detailing can be. Look at the decorative forming here, and then also down here, in case you can't see that. That's all carved into it. It's just a remarkable work of sculpture on a massive scale, and this is occurring during this time. Chinese painting has certain key points. They literally had, as it says here, Jia He set down key points. Says, okay, if you're going to paint, keep these ideas in mind. Do this. It says, strive for a sense of movement. Use the brush method. Try to depict the forms of things as they are. Describe appearances using color. Divide and plan it, position and arrange it. Don't just go into it haphazardly. Don't just start with canvas saying, well, let me see what I can come up with. Have a plan in place. Point the different areas on your canvas, what you will put in each place, and work that way. And then follow models. Look at what others have done. Practice your skills by copying those until you have mastered the ability to make that image, and then move on to creating your own. Calligraphy comes into play during this time, and we can see, wrong one, some of that. This is part of the ink on paper image. It's nearly 60 feet long, and you have, as it says here, over 1,200 cursive characters. You have other artwork. Again, just a beautiful, beautiful work. Fairly large, 80 inches by 40 inches, so 3.5 feet by approximately a little over, well, not quite 7 feet. But again, just a beautiful work. You can see the delicate aspects of this, the use of the fine detailing that is offered here, and that continues down here into this part where you can see, hopefully, that they've even put in animals and the plants and the details. All this is part of this really elaborate artwork. And this is what the 6 points of Jia He tries to get across. It's just a beautiful time of artwork that's developing during the Tang into the Song Dynasty. And you can see this one here, the use of color and images as well. Again, ink and color on silk, very much part of what they do. You have these details set out for you, as I said, by Jia He. Well, later, Giannini is going to offer his views about how artists need to develop. This is in the Renaissance, and we'll get to that a few chapters from now. But it's also offering some of the same advice that Jia He had offered to the poets in the 6th century CE. So about 1,000 years later, the same advice is being followed. What we also have in this era, during developing from this one, again, bear with me, Sengeji's, there we go, is that you have Japan developing. Now, what's interesting about Japan, it's close to China, Korea here, and Russia. You can see how close it is across here just to Russia and to these areas, how close it is to Korea, the Korean Strait. But we really don't have necessarily that much connection early in Japan with these mainland cultures. What we do know is that they have people there. I think it was a couple of chapters back I was talking about earliest pottery being about 5,000 BCE. Well, that's not right, because on Japan, in different areas, archaeological finds have come up with pottery, which your book says goes back at least to 10,000 BCE. Dating, it says, before 10,000 BCE pottery. That means ceramics. That means use of fire to cast these and to proof them through the fire to help shape these. They have been decorated. Art is part of it. And here's what's really great. We don't know who these people really are. They call them the Jomon or the Homon, Jomon. Your book mentions it here. These people were hunter-gatherers, but they stopped. How they reached Japan, unknown. Where they came from, not quite sure. You can imagine, as we've seen so often, there's one theory, the Russian steppes, that maybe they came from an area here and just simply at one time maybe there was more of a land bridge, so they were able to walk, or they were able to come up with smaller crafts and they were able to sell this narrow area here. We don't know. It's unclear where they came from. What we do know is that these inhabitants, these people on Japan, were there for a long, long time, over 10,000 years. That's what we know. So they were there and crafting and farming and creating settings of civilization. It says here, staying in one place long enough. They are part of it. They have established settlements, and they were doing that well before the pyramids were created, well before the Minoan or Mycenaean or the Greek city-states came about, but we're not sure where they came from. What we do, they're called Jomon or Homon because of their ceramic techniques, and this gives you an example of that. This is probably a ceremonial vessel because it doesn't look as if it's something you could drink from on a daily basis. Another theory is that maybe it was used for storage purposes and that there might have been some sort of lid that fit in here. But you can see the ornamentation, the use of a pattern. That there is a standard that is being followed. There's something that is considered how you do this. You can see the sides, the different fluting here, and then this structure here, the different rippling effect. This is where the name comes from because the way they made this into the clay, they took string, cord, and put it into it to create these ripples, these curvings, and the designs that they wanted, and then they fire baked it. Some suppositions are that then the cord would burn away, leaving this. Others that once it was put into place, they would pull it out and then pull the cord off. Either way could work. But you have these designs that are clearly ornamental, that are used for some purpose. And so you have a group of people, 10,000 BCE and on, who are creating art. They're creating functionality. They're crafting using technology for the ceramics. All this is occurring at a very, very early age. This is called the flame style. Some of the earliest pieces that they found for it, about 2,500 or so BCE, which of course that puts you at the time that the Mycenaean culture probably was going on, that the Minoan culture was going on, 1,000 years before King Tut, for instance. This would be in the Old Kingdom, maybe the early Middle Kingdom of Egypt. It's 600-700 years before the Code of Hammurabi in the Middle East. Those just the remnants of the pottery that have been found. There's no, we have other aspects to it as well. As it says here, seems to have fortified agricultural communities. Been around for a while. They date them to about 200 CE, but clearly had been around much earlier. There seemed to be a leader, and each area seemed to have its own religious views. In the 300s, you start having the contact with the mainland area, China, Korea, etc., and they brought with them their views and attitudes. Soon Buddhism comes in in the 6th century and 7th century, 600s. You have Buddhism being brought over. It becomes a strong religious attitude and view, along with the native religious views in Japan that is called Shintoism. We have burial mounds that have been found in archaeological digs. Clearly, an important aspect. There also, these individuals have been found buried with objects. Again, as it says here, the Emperor of Nintoku in Osaka has around 20,000 different statues of warriors in his tomb. Nara, if we look at the map over here, this is Nara, okay, now called Heijo. This is right here. And that was the first laid out imperial capital, as your book mentions here. It seemed to be highly influenced by Chinese design, but eventually a new capital, Kyoto, which is, again, on the map, it's over here. It's now called Heian, but that's Kyoto, and that was the new capital that was developed. And again, large city, as it says here, it was a center of government for a period of about 400 years, over 300. And so Japan grows in a number of areas. It has this religion called Shintoism, which does not have a particular god, in the sense that they don't form different images to the god. Bear with me as it's waiting for MindTap. Yes, we'll wait, as MindTap is Cengage is having some difficulty today. They're a little slow. But Shintoism is, as it says here, they have gods, but they don't make gods into shapes. Rather, they are spirits. And so they don't try to make any fabrications or statues or any other depictions of these gods. Because again, it's like the god of wind. How do you draw the wind? So they don't draw their gods. They worship them instead. And that's Shintoism. Well, Buddhism comes in, as I said, probably brought over by the Chinese, and they again start having this religion brought through. Likewise, architectural style gets incorporated, copying some of the style from China, and then making it their own as well. And this is the Phoenix Hall, as your book mentions. Again, a Buddhist temple. We also have, again, the development of theater, the No theater and later Kabuki theater, the use of masks to convey expressions and costuming so that you can have male and female characters, although probably all the actors would have been male. And so, again, it's a key aspect that we see here that's developed in this way. Tells you about the No theater. And what's really interesting is that poetry is also part of it. They have a number of different poetic forms, and some of you are probably familiar with haiku. This is developing during this era. But you also have work by other individuals, including, they give you Lady Murasaki Shikibu. And you'll see she's writing basically the late 10th, early 11th century. She writes a work called The Tale of Jinji. It really is a novel. Focusing in your book tells you the summary of it here in just a moment. Prince Jinji, as he's trying to deal with issues. But you also have poetry written during this time. Murasaki Shikibu was part of the court. She had married. Her husband, though, died. Her father, also a minor official, was transferred out to the provinces, as it says in her book, off to one area. She didn't want to leave the city, the capital area, so she became a member of the court to the empress. And it's during this time that she also wrote. You have several of them are presented, including Shinogen's Pillow Book, where we have writing about the days. It's almost like it says here a diary, collection of notes and observations, and what was taking place, all the little scandals. Say Shinogen writes all of that down. Murasaki Shikibu better known as just Murasaki, writes instead literally an extended work of fiction, what we call the novel, where you have Prince Genji going along and seeing things and having certain experiences. As it says here, Genji the prince is married to an older woman, but he wants his father's consort, and again, resembling he loves her, Fujitsubo, who resembles his own mother. So again, Oedipal storyline as part of this, and again, it's as it says here, quite a bit that takes place, and it's a really interesting story to go through. It's a novel. As it says here, though, it offers this gulf between the sensibilities of the aristocrat elite and their sense of beauty and the aesthetics, and then also what takes place for the majority of the population, who had to spend most of their time not contemplating garden, not contemplating relationships, not writing poetry, but working in a very laborious manner. As we move through here, and again, bear with me as Cengage seems to be a little slow today. The development of Japan as a culture becomes really important because they do keep themselves isolated because of the fact that Japan is an island. Again, bear with me as we're trying to get this to call up, and it just takes a little bit of time. We wait again. Cengage will eventually get here, we hope. Part of it may have to do with weather conditions. I am streaming this from home, so weather conditions can impact. What we do wind up having in this idea of Japan as sort of an isolated island kingdom is this focus on rule by a caste system or a class system. And the idea about the feudal control, where you have an emperor and enforcing that through a warrior class, and then having the working class. Eventually, the shogun, which essentially like your book translates as barbarian suppressing commander-in-chief, is essentially what Taishogun or just shogun means. The shogun is essentially the general, the overriding leader of the military, just under the emperor. And eventually what's going to happen is that later a shogun is going to push himself into the position of running Japan, that there's a military effort to it. Says here you have bands of warriors following the aristocrat leader who is bound to the emperor. Well, at one time, one of the shoguns is going to push for control, and the emperor is relegated to being beneath the shogun. This is a key aspect. So you have these views offered. This is the statue here. This idea of this image that's offered, which is, as is the sage Kuya invoking the Buddha. And so you have this aspect here, and again, see the figures here. Your book mentions the details about that figure, and it talks about yeah, here it is. It's a wooden sculpture where you have the drapery folds, use the illusion of actual eyes. We had crystals put in. The artist renders speech 6 tiny images of Buddha come forth from the sage's mouth, representing the syllables of a prayer, repeating the name of Buddha. And that's a key aspect where we see representational as well as realistic art occurring at this time. And again, bear with me as it's trying to call this up. One more time, here we go. And we are reaching the end of the chapter, by the way. Patience is a virtue. We can all practice our Taoist attitude here as we simply recognize the things we cannot control. At the end of the chapter, which will give you a summary of the major details and concepts that you can look at. And that takes us back to how you need to approach your upcoming exam. Each chapter, if you'll simply go back to each chapter and look at the end of every chapter, you'll see the same big picture summary. It's a review of the key points and details within the chapter set out in some of the major categories: language and literature, art, architecture, music, and what each one of these had, the philosophy and religion, the ones for China, and then finally the ones for Japan also laid out for you in that way. And you can look at these, and every chapter has something laid out the same way. You can go to each chapter through the different modules and click on the book and simply go to the chapter contents here and click on the last part where it says big picture and look at that way. You can also go over here to where it says the full book, this little icon here, and if you click on it, the full book opens. Bear with me. Again, it's going to take just a little while. Right up here, the table of contents, and if you click on that, you can click on, for instance, beginnings, and that will call up, and you can go down here, click on, say, glossary, and what it does is all the key terms that were highlighted in the chapter are here, and you can click on those. For instance, Middle Kingdom, here's the time period for it, and then if you go to the next page, here's that big picture again. So you can do this, clicking on that little icon of the book, everything will open right here for you. You don't necessarily have to go through every single module and every single chapter, but this gives you all the summary. And then if you want further detail about it, you can click on the chapter. For instance, let's go to Rome. We'll just do Rome. And here are the different ones. If you need to know something about Etruscan art, or if you need to know about Roman music, you click here, and there's the detail from the chapter itself. And so you actually can access the entire book this way. For instance, going back to the Rise of Greece, you click on it. Here's the different divisions of the chapter. And if you want to know about Herodotus, you can click on there and look at it. Go here, it'll take you to the glossary. So if you need to know about what in the world is a Kythera, there you go. Or if you need to know about naturalism, what does that mean? There you go. It'll tell you. And so, again, this is a way that you can prepare for your exam that you need to be taking by Sunday night. And again, folks, I'm not expecting you to remember all these terms from every single chapter, but I do want you to learn this as best you can and understand it and recognize it. So if you want to know about lyric poetry, look here and there's the details about it, about Sappho, for instance, and what her works are like. You have the example there of it, and the other example there. If you need to know about, let's go to classic Greek, the Hellenistic period. If you need to know about classical sculpture, well, here you go, click on it that way. And when you're taking your exam, don't hesitate to use the book. Again, as I was saying, I do not expect you to remember all these, but I would like you to study it and learn about it. And as you're taking your test, if you have, again, it's a time test, 90 minutes. Please make sure that you do your best to get started early enough so you don't run out of time. Stay focused. It's 40 questions, multiple choice, and then you have 4 questions that are detailed. And we're going to look at that very quickly. Let me go back to the modules. So when you click on the modules, and again, bear with us as it's trying to get this called up. The exam is in a separate module. You just have to scroll down and get a moment, as this is all going to jump in just a moment. As soon as it finishes loading everything. I'll try and move it down anyway. I'm having to wait because when it looks like that, with it still circling for me, trying to get all this loaded. There we go. The jump took place. If you scroll down, you'll see the exams. These other ones are not opened yet. But there's exam 1. Under the exam module, you'll click on it, and it will open just the way it has with your reading quizzes. As it tells you here, it covers chapters 1 through 4. You have 40 multiple choice questions worth 2 points each, and you have 4 short answer paragraph style questions. And so I do expect you to answer those, and those are 5 points each for a total of 100 points. For the short response questions, please understand that responses need to be complete with full details and explanation. First, all your answers need to be in complete sentences, no fragments. As a rule of thumb, keep this in mind. Responses should be longer than the questions so that you are having an adequate response with adequate details. I also teach English, folks, so yes, form, spelling, other grammatical mistakes do count against you. I will take off from the maximum of 5 points. So please make sure that you are following through those. So again, 40 multiple choice questions, 4 short answer questions, meaning that answering complete sentences with full details and explanation. Your responses should be longer than the questions. And again, I hope you have good luck with that. You have through Sunday evening to take this exam. It does cover chapters 1 through 4. Use the book, folks. I would strongly suggest that you do that. And again, I hope everything will go well for you. Again, we'll get this posted as soon as I can. And good luck with everything that is taking place. And I will have another discussion next week as we get to meet, depending upon how weather is going to turn out. Today we were closed.